Okay, let's discuss something else that was recently released by NASA that once again maybe it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. But in this case, something that's absolutely beautiful and something that's based on an image that a lot of us have already seen before. The gorgeous image of the Ring Nebula that I guess kind of resembles some kind of an eye. But turns out that this eye was also hiding something that you can kind of see in red right there. And so in this video we're going to discuss exactly what scientists believe this is, why this is kind of exciting, but also discuss several other planetary nebula recently imaged by Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope, such as the famous Helix Nebula that actually looks very similar because it was produced by a very similar event. But to start, I once again briefly wanted to explain what planetary nebula are and how they're not supernova. And to do this, let's start by looking at one of the recent images of a supernova released by NASA as well. And specifically, a very famous supernova, the Kepler supernova, where we now actually see dramatic changes that happen in approximately 2 decades. And well, basically here you can literally see the supernova remnant expanding in real time. And that's despite the fact that the actual supernova happened back in the 1600s, or specifically 1604, with this event observed and reported on by the famous Johannes Kepler. And while this is essentially the end of a star that's usually much more massive than the Sun, the star explodes, leaves behind some kind of a remnant, usually a neutron star or a black hole, but the shell around it expands very fast, usually at least a few hundred kilometers per second, but sometimes even faster. But then in contrast we have something like this. This is a planetary nebula, and it has nothing to do with planets, with the name itself coming from a kind of a misunderstanding of the early astronomers. Because from a distance some of these objects do resemble planets like Jupiter, but are also kind of cloudy looking, early astronomers classified them as planetary nebula. But today we know that this is once again the end of a star. But normally a star very similar to our Sun, and our Sun is going to go through one of these as well, where once the star reaches a certain age, it starts to inflate itself and throws away a lot of its outer shells, eventually leaving only core in the center, and that core eventually becomes a white dwarf. And quite a few of these objects are known to us, with many of them possessing different shapes and producing different colors. And that's because all of the stars that produce them are generally just a little bit different. And quite a few of them have been known to us for nearly 300 years. As a matter of fact, the Ring Nebula, also known as NGC 6720, was officially discovered over 250 years ago, back in 1779, and it was discovered by the famous French astronomer Charles Messier, who designated this as the 57th object he discovered, so it's also known as M57. This is just over 2000 light years away from planet Earth. And here's actually a really cool image taken by Gore and Nilsson at the Liverpool telescope, showing this nebula in a slightly different light. But recently, a team led by Roger Wesson, whose study as always you can find in a description, used a new instrument called WEAVE on the William Herschel telescope. And here, by analyzing this nebula in a slightly different way, they discovered something that's never been seen before. A giant cloud that was shaped like a bar and contained a lot of ionized iron. And it seemed to stretch across the entire heart of the nebula, essentially resembling something like this. And to give you an idea of the scale here, this is about 1,000 times more far away than Pluto is from the Sun, so it's about 40,000 astronomical units. But even more incredible in this case is the mass. Here researchers estimate that it's about as massive as Mars is in terms of the total amount of iron, and specifically pure glowing iron. And that by itself is a little bit strange, because normally we expect a lot of this iron in nebula to be actually locked inside various solid dust grains that slowly dissipate without producing any of these emissions. Yet here it was found to be basically naked and ionized, and more importantly in a perfectly straight line. And that's right now a major puzzle. Because at first it almost looks like some kind of a jet shooting from both directions of the central star, except that the motion in this case is completely wrong. Normally a jet would show one end moving toward us and the other one away from us, but this entire bar appears to be moving away as one unit. And furthermore, the central star, the white dwarf, is not lined up with the middle bar at all. You can see it a little bit better in this image. And so the obvious question is, so what is it? And how did it get here? And though right now there is no exact explanation yet, there are at least 2 possibilities. And the first one is actually kind of exciting. One of the ideas is that this is a vaporized rocky planet. And specifically a planet not so different from planet Earth, because in this case all of this iron could have been coming from its core which in this case would be very similar to the one inside our own planet. So this could be literally remains of a destroyed world that might have been shredded by the central star thousands of years ago. Now, since this planetary nebula is just over 1600 years old, it means that this planet was destroyed in somewhat recent times, basically within the last 2000 years. And if this is correct, then the star vaporized this planet, leaving behind all of this iron. But not everyone agrees with this explanation, especially because we don't really expect to see something like this. If this was a planet that was destroyed by a star, it should have formed some kind of a messy debris cloud and not a neat straight bar. And we should also see other elements like, for example, magnesium and silicon, which have not been spotted in this case. Which means that other scientists proposed a different explanation. Maybe this is some kind of a dust destruction, basically formed from the cosmic dust itself. And we know that cosmic dust usually contains iron, and so maybe this is where it's coming from. And observations from the James Webb show dust on either side of this iron bar, but not overlapping it, suggesting that something very specific inside this region seems to be destroying dust and releasing the iron. But the problem with this explanation is that this would require very high temperatures and extremely powerful shock waves. But the center of this nebula seems to be very serene and very quiet. We don't really see any shock waves or a lot of temperature. And so once again, here the explanation is not complete. And that means that at least for now, this is going to remain a bit of a mystery. And so despite this being one of the most photographed objects in the night skies, this particular secret has only been discovered extremely recently. But that was not the only observation from different planetary nebula in the last few months, because a lot of new images actually reveal to us that a lot of these objects are much more complex than just simple bubbles that scientists previously imagined. And so here's an image of another really famous nebula referred to as the Butterfly Nebula, NGC 6302. And compared to the other nebula, this one is bipolar. Basically has two distinct poles, or two distinct lobes, that make them look like wings of a butterfly. And in this case, what makes this interesting is actually the central star. Turns out that this is one of the hottest stars known to us, at approximately 250,000 Celsius, which is why it's able to create these powerful emissions and illuminate so much gas. But recently, some of the new images also showed us this gas tearing through space at over 3 million kilometers per hour, or approximately 800 kilometers per second. And so hopefully in the next few decades, scientists continuously take more images of this, just to once again see how it changes over time, and to show us the evolution of this object as a kind of a time-lapse. And last but not least, we had the famous Eye of God, the Helix Nebula. This was an image by the James Webb Space Telescope that recently was able to zoom in on some of the intricate details, and especially the bizarre cometary pillars you see right there. And these are knots created by cold gas and dust being sculpted by the blistering winds coming from the very hot central star, once again a white dwarf. And so as the winds from the star interact with this gas, they create these beautiful formations. And what we're seeing here is a very stark transition from the hottest ionized gas to the coldest molecular hydrogen at the edges, which is of course what happens in most of these nebula, and why some of them do look very similar. And intriguingly, this particular nebula was one of the first where these unusual knots were even discovered. And here's a slightly earlier image of this from a few years back. And each of these individual knots is actually around the same size as the entire solar system. So these are not small objects. But obviously in terms of mass, they're much less massive. And based on the recent count, there seems to be at least 40,000 of these in this nebula alone. Each of them relatively similar in shape and relatively similar in size, but each of them containing enough dust and enough gas only to make one single planet Earth. Which is of course a somewhat intriguing question to ask. So what's going to happen to these knots, and can they actually create planets at the end? Or basically, what happens to all of this gas and dust once the activity from the planetary nebula subsides? But since we don't even know how they form and what exactly produces them, trying to find out what they evolve into is not something we can answer yet. But because our sun might one day become something very similar and produce very similar effects, this is one of those questions astronomers are trying to answer. And on top of this, many of these planetary nebulae are also known as the galactic recyclers. They usually expel and propagate a lot of heavier elements like carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, which eventually results in the next generation of stars and planets. In fact, the iron we found inside the Ring Nebula may one day end up in a future terrestrial planet. And so in essence, this shows us a kind of a galactic recycling system. a system that continuously enriches a lot of elements and continuously creates more and more complexity in various stars and planetary systems. But at least for now, we seem to have more mysteries than actual answers. With I guess the biggest mystery being this. What exactly caused this unusual iron formation? And that means that we'll probably come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos, especially as astronomers use very similar techniques to try to see if they find these in other planetary nebulae as well. And so until these future updates, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.